Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I hope folk have access to a little handout, which I don't know if we'll get through it all, but it's just giving you the actual texts and sources of most of the quotations from different people I'm going to use. But it also gives you a piece of paper to kind of write notes on and something to take home. So, let's see if this will support my watch. It's really good to be here. It's good to be in a whole, and as we've heard, scandalously neglected bit of Lewis country, a really significant piece of terrain. I'm going to talk in a minute about Shakespeare's dictum that poetry has to take what might otherwise float away airily and give it a local habitation and a name. And I think we're redressing an imbalance in coming back to really important local habitation of Lewis, and therefore a significant part of who he is. So one of the themes of this day is embodiment, and that's the theme I want to pick up on. It was beautifully picked up on by both our speakers earlier on. I loved that reflection on reading Out of the Silent Planet in a sort of post-pandemic moment, and the urgency of actual encounter as well as its challenges, and of course that lovely thing on the neglected Irishness and austeriority of Lewis. So I want to start with a place in Lewis where he uses the phrase giving body. And it's a late book of Lewis's. It's in Reflections on the Psalms, which, let's be specific and particular, this is what it looked like when it came out as the first edition. It came out in 58. So it's quite a late work of Lewis's. It's a mature reflection. And in the introduction to that book, he says something very instructive about the Psalms, but in the end about poetry. He says that the Psalms are emphatically poetry, that they have to be read as poetry with all the license on the one hand and all the formality on the other of what poetry is. And he goes on to talk about the beautiful poetic technique of parallelism in the Psalms, which he brilliantly just describes. Parallelism is where you say one thing in one set of terms, then you repeat it in a variation of terms that reflects back on the first. O Lord, open thou our lips, and our mouth shall proclaim thy praise, that kind of thing. And he talks about how that, he calls it thought rhyme. He says, whereas the rhyme scheme of a poem, which is a rhyme scheme in sound, is, strictly speaking, impossible to translate. But perhaps it was a divine providence that this extraordinary book of poems, which would be lying there at the heart of Scripture, were written in a poetic form, which is perhaps the most translatable of all poetic forms. He then goes on to discuss how Christ's own utterances sometimes took on and reflected the parallelism, the poetic technique of the Psalms. So he gives us an example. He says, our Lord was soaked in the poetic tradition of his country. He delighted to use it. And then he quotes, for with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again. Lewis comments, the second half of the verse makes no logical addition. It echoes with variation the first. Another example, ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. The variation is a variation proper to poetry. And then comes the passage I've given you as the first thing here. And this is on the idea that Jesus was uttering carefully formed poetry in the poetical form of his own local tradition, the Psalms. And there are two sentences in this little passage. One is really quite complex and has a very balanced parenthetical phrase in the middle of it. You've really got to stretch your grammar a bit to get to it. And then it's followed by a really short, punchy sentence, which utterly sums it up. And that's very much in Lewis's style. So let's just take a little look at what he says. It's a very strange, it's almost a kind of circumspection around. It's a kind of delicate finding of names for the unnameable. Here's what he says. It seems to me appropriate, almost inevitable, that when that great imagination, which in the beginning, for its own delight and for the delight of men and angels and in their proper mode of beasts, had invented and formed the whole world of nature, submitted to express itself in human speech, that speech should sometimes be poetry. Now, he could have made that a little simpler, but there's a kind of something deliberate, something almost, there's a kind of aspect of proper respect to the mystery of God. He doesn't say, well, I think it's a good thing that when God made the world for the delight of all its inhabitants and then submitted to become a part of his world, that he should use this particular form of poetry. But it doesn't call him God, does he? He says, when that great imagination. Now, this is progress for Lewis. If you look at the early Lewis and his fears and suspicions of his own imagination, and the long, great war he had with Owen Barfield about whether or not the imagination could bear truth. See how far he's travelled, that just a few years before his death, he is happy to call God, and I think specifically God the Son, the Logos, the one in whom and through whom everything was made. Well knowing, of course, because he has his New Testament Greek, that the word for made in that preface to John's Gospel is poiein. That's why the Scots are right to call poets makers. When in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. There was no poetry without him, would be another way of saying. The world was made as a poem in him and through him. He knows what that word made. So now he's gone so far as to call the Logos, in whom all things were made in the beginning. He uses the phrase both from Genesis and John. He's prepared to call him that great imagination. That's an astonishing thing. He gets there through Coleridge and others, as I hope to show. But he calls God that great imagination, which in the beginning, for its own delight and for the delight of men and angels, and then he can't help putting in, and in their proper mode of beasts. He's very inclusive here. I know men isn't inclusive language now, but he clearly intends to include the whole of humanity. But he wants to include more than the whole of humanity. He wants to include those angelic intelligences of which we hear some whisper and rumour, but whose form we could never entirely comprehend because of its another order for ours, though in his description of the elders, he went a long way towards that. You've got several modes of being. You've got men, humanity in the middle, and the creation is for all of them, and is intended both that God should delight in them and that they should delight in God. But the mode of God's godness in which that delight happens, for Lewis here, is the imagination. That great imagination had invented and formed the whole world of nature. That great imagination, we've still got to keep the word, submitted, very careful choice of the word submitted. There's an echo there, surely. There's a whole theology of kenosis, that though he was found in form equal to God, he did not cling to equality with God, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. That God comes in and obeys his own rules and conforms to the world which he himself formed, and learns to speak a particular language and has a local habitation and a particular place. That when that great imagination enters the world and submits to express itself in human speech, so the acquisition of language is a kind of paradoxical submission. We submit to the language and the way language is formed, but then the way language is formed empowers and enables us. There's a sense in which for the poet, the service of language is also a kind of perfect freedom. It's a very important word there, submit. When that great imagination that made nature submitted to express itself in human speech, that speech should sometimes be poetry. And then, as we're sort of gasping and trying to find our way grammatically through that highly complex sentence, he sums it up, he embodies it in a much more particular way in the second sentence. For poetry, too, is a little incarnation, giving body to what has been before been invisible and inaudible. I want, in the time that I've got, to do two things. I want to unpack particularly that second little sentence. Poetry too is a little incarnation, giving body to what had before been invisible and inaudible. And then I want to talk a little bit about how Lewis got to this glorious affirmation of the imagination and of poetry as absolutely proper to God the Word, and in the mouth of God the Word made flesh in Jesus. How he got there. So let's start with just unpacking this idea of poetry is a little incarnation, giving body to what had been before invisible and inaudible. I think Lewis is echoing, I think consciously, possibly unconsciously, Lewis, I'm glad we've got someone writing on Lewis and Shakespeare, because, Lewis absorbed Shakespeare so deeply that it was, part of his very thought patterning. But I think the allusion here to the famous passage about poetry in A Midsummer Night's Dream is conscious because of the giving body and the invisible. I'm just giving you here in the next extract the core of it. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. You can see immediately the language of body. You can see how the airy nothing, the thing you couldn't quite get hold of, has now been given visible and audible form. And those beautiful words that every artist loves: bodies, form, shape. It's an astonishing passage about poetry. And for a long time, when I read it and loved it, I always thought it was only about poetry. And insofar as it was only about poetry, it was brilliant. Shakespeare's account of it there. Brilliant, particularly in that moment where Shakespeare unexpectedly juxtaposes the two words imagination and bodies. I mean, if we were to do, I would never do this, but if I was to do that slightly awkward thing that speakers sometimes do, where you divide the audience into half and everybody has to go into little buzz groups and then report back. Fear not, I'm not going to do this. But if I were to do that, and I said, well, over here I want you people to be word brainstorming and word associating with the word imagination, and over here I want you people to be, brainstorming and word associating about bodies, my guess is that we would get clusters of words and associations from two completely different registers. That the imagination people, it would all be a bit spiritual and thin and diaphanous, and there might be a few sort of glowing unicorns and fine rainbows, but it would all be a little bit shimmery and unrooted. And depending on your mood and feeling of the day, the bodies people, it would either all be glorious sculpted bodies and rippling muscles and, delicious curves, or it would be all about aching joints and blood and sweat and the dankness of cold clothes in the morning, or whatever. But we wouldn't find much of a meeting place. We would somehow assume that the imagination and the imaginative was disembodied. Not so, says Shakespeare. The whole purpose of the imagination, he says, is to take something which we would otherwise have not comprehended or got hold of and give it a body, give it a bodily form. You may remember that earlier on in that speech, just before this passage, and a little later on, just after this passage, Shakespeare carefully pairs two words which are about different ways of knowing. That is to say, apprehend and comprehend. You remember earlier on he says that imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. And then after this passage, he says, if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. Now, apprehend and comprehend are paired on a kind of polar, what Coleridge would call a polar logic. There's a sense in which we see them as at opposite ends of ways of knowing. You know the sense. Obviously, the prehend bit of apprehend and comprehend in Latin is about getting hold of something. So, there are some monkeys that have prehensile tails. They can actually pick things up with them, which would be really useful. But if you apprehend, you reach out and can just about touch a bit of it. If you comprehend, you understand it comprehensively, you can get your mind all around it. Something is going on in Shakespeare between apprehend and comprehend, imagination and body, and also heaven and earth and heaven. The point about the poet, Shakespeare is saying, is that the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. We have two trajectories. How do we ever connect them? Heaven, the apprehended, the invisible, the inaudible, if you like, as he would put it here. And earth, the comprehended, the visible, the known. But earth without heaven is just a dull clod. But heaven without earth is inapprehensible, incomprehensible. You know, as you say, if you get around to reading the Athanasian Creed ever, it'll say the whole thing totally incomprehensible. And yet heaven chooses in Christ to be bodied forth. Now, when I thought this was just about poetry, this passage from Shakespeare, I found it helpful, and I particularly found it helpful to think of the two trajectories. On the one hand, the glance from heaven to earth, and on the other hand, the glance from earth to heaven. And I felt it was a very helpful way of looking about how poets and artists work. It doesn't matter which end you start, the point is to connect them. So you can have, just to take two 20th century and, in Heaney's case, 21st century examples. If you take a poet like Eliot, Eliot has this great power of abstraction. He's a highly intellectual man. He's written, this dissertation, this PhD on F.H. Bradley, and transcendental idealism and all of that. But he's a poet. And he starts with the heavenly, with the apprehension, with something that we might never get hold of at all. And then he works hard to bring it down to earth and to find one image after another to body it forth. You can see it in the early Eliot, can't you say, where he says, literally, I must borrow every changing shape to find expression, dance like a dancing bear, chatter like an ape. Or where he says so brilliantly in Prufrock, a wonderful image, he says, I should have been a pair of silent claws, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. He's really embodied a certain feeling of weirdness and alienation, and, it's brilliant. He starts with the heavenly, and he looks at, and of course in his mature poetry, in the four quartets, you see it even more. He actually breaks into his own poetry, doesn't he? He gives you a beautiful passage of poetry, and then he says, well, that was a way of putting it, an unsatisfactory way of putting it. And he talks about his poetic effort as a series of raids on the inarticulate, with shabby equipment, always deteriorating in the general mass of imprecision of feeling. So he starts at the heavenly, but he's successful as a poet because he does, in fact, body forth in a series of images which communicate long before they're understood. Eliot is always quoted as saying that poetry needs to be difficult, which led, I think, some of his followers to the unfortunate conclusion that if it's difficult, it must be poetry, which is not the case. But he also said true poetry communicates before it's understood, and it communicates because the images are so real and so compelling and are able to body forth again and again a series of things that otherwise would have been only apprehended. Eliot also famously said that poetry is peripheral vision, that you see it, but if you turn to look at it, it's gone. But if you remain still enough, you can woo the peripheral vision in to the center. So I used to think, well, it's a good account of poetry from Shakespeare here. It works for Eliot, heaven to earth. And then I think probably the greatest example, certainly in our time, of the poet whose eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, glances from earth to heaven. That is to say, starts with the absolutely embodied and particular, but writes about it in such a way that their particular account of the particular opens itself. It's kind of roofless. It opens itself up to body forth or to connect you to a whole series of apprehensions that you've had and would otherwise have missed. So the first poem that Heaney wrote that he felt was a satisfactory poem, and which is the poem that opens his first volume with Faber at any rate, Death of a Naturalist, Digging, is an exact example of that. I mean, he starts for a moment with the problem of writing, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. And then he appears to be interrupted in his high-minded pursuit of the literary, sitting in the upstairs room with the window half open, trying to be the poet, in this farmyard in the north. And, of course, what he's interrupted by is the sound of digging and the sound of the spade in the gravelly earth, and he looks down to see his father digging potatoes. And then he looks deeper, and he sees his grandfather cutting turf on Toner's bog. And he brings you into the particularity. He talks about the feel of the potatoes in the hands, and when he gets to the digging, he says, the squelch and slap, the cuts through peat, and a wonderful piece of bravado, my grandfather could cut more turf than any other man on Toner's bog, and he remembers taking the milk to him. So you're reading this poem, and, going down and down for the good stuff, there's the grandfather. And if you're an Englishman like me, who loves Ireland and visits and has enjoyed, but you're thinking, well, thank you, Seamus, I really get a feeling for a spade now. I know what digging's about. Oh, look, there's another 3 lines about digging. I'm there, I've got it. Is there anything else? And suddenly, magnificently, in a kind of coup de théâtre at the end of that poem, there is. He says, but I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. And suddenly, as soon as you read those lines, I'll dig with it, you revisit every account of digging in that poem. And you find it has embodied certain things you knew or half knew or begin to apprehend about writing as being about not the surface, but going down and down for the good stuff, about cutting through living roots, about the 2 purposes of the digging that he describes, the potato digging to feed, to nurture, to nourish, and the digging for the peat to warm, to bring the focus to the hearth. Suddenly, all those things have become powerful emblems of what poetry is at its best. And it's all opened in that final phrase, I'll dig with it. His eye glances from earth to heaven, if you like, if we stand heaven as meaning the otherwise invisible, the otherwise only apprehended but never comprehended, the so-called airy nothing that might slip away, is bodied forth and given a local habitation and a name. Now, for a long time, I'd only read that as being about poetry, but about 16 or 17 years ago, when I began to work on what became the book Faith, Hope and Poetry that came out 12 years ago, I was rereading this Shakespeare text, but now thinking about this in light of theology, in light of a theology of the incarnation. And it occurred to me, and here I have to make a confession, I thought this was an original thought. I mean, I'm not sure there are any really original thoughts. I think there are thoughts which are generous and generative, and we kind of all go to the same place to have the thought. But I thought this was an original thought. I was reading this passage of Shakespeare, and I was going, what does it remind me of? It reminds me of something. This thing about heaven, earth, heaven, about the gap between them. This thing about bodies, imagination, which should be the heavenly word, bodies. This thing about local habitation and a name. What is this? How did I get there? What's the connection? And suddenly it dawned on me that Shakespeare was, with kind of grace and a certain amount of irony, since it was supposed to be set BC, Midsummer Night's Dream, that he was riffing on the prologue to John's Gospel. He was riffing on the great account of incarnation, where you remember in the beginning of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was in the beginning with God. It's all going round up there. You can't see it. You can't hear it. It's in the realm of abstraction. And as you're reading it, you're thinking, I'm sure this is great philosophy, and if I knew a lot of great philosophy and theology, and there's some Greek philosophy in there, and you're kind of, but like, you don't get it. You're just kind of reading through and thinking, help me here. And then suddenly you get to verse 14, And this logos you've been hearing all about, that was enarche, it was in the beginning, suddenly you hear the words, and the word was made flesh and dwelt, had its habitation, dwelt among us. And then a little bit longer, and we beheld, we saw it, the poet's eye to see, we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And I suddenly went back to the Shakespeare and thought, what if he's actually saying, look, what we poets do is only a little reflection of the thing the great poet has already done. We poets want to body forth our meaning and can only get it there if we're using making a real visible, tangible, touchable, living body for it. And the more living and local habitation it is, the more likely it is to body forth the universal. There isn't a quarrel between the particular and the universal, you know. And what if Shakespeare was deliberately touching on that and saying, well, we're doing this because we're made in the image of a maker. As Tolkien later put it, we make still by the law by which we're made, he says in Mytho-poetic, the poem. So here was I thinking, oh, wow, this is beautiful. There's a whole theology of poetry, there's a whole theology of imagination here. Oh, I could get a book out of this. Anyway, so there I was, you know, thinking about that. And I thought it was my insight. So you can imagine the little shock of recognition when during the beginning of the pandemic, I reread this book, which I'd read when I was in the sixth form and read again when I was an undergraduate. But, you know, it had gone so deep inside. I thought my idea that there is a direct parallel between the theology of incarnation on the one hand and the making of a poem on the other. I thought this was my idea. And there am I, reading a book I know I read several times in my youth. And he says, poetry too is a little incarnation, giving body to what had been before invisible and inaudible. The whole kernel and seed of a theology that I tried to open out had all been there in C.S.Lewis after all. So at least, the very least I can do is acknowledge my debt to this honest Ulsterman and recognize that he'd sowed a seed. But we can still reasonably ask the question, I think, how did Lewis himself get there? And that itself is part of the story of his conversion. And in the story of his conversion, the story of the integration in Lewis himself of his two great faculties, the two great faculties for coming to know things that we all have and that he had absolutely in spades, and that is reason and imagination. Now, readers of Surprised by Joy will know the famous passage in which he talks very eloquently about the joy he had in the vision of northernness, very appropriate for this setting, and you know, the Norse mythologies and the voice crying, Balder the beautiful is dead, and all these glorious things that he was reading and he was deeply moved by. But in the end, they were a kind of cheat. They were, as he said in the famous conversation with Tolkien, which changed everything on Addison's Walk, he said, they're lies, even though they're lies breathed through silver, to which Tolkien replied, they're not lies. And there began the great change that led to Lewis's own conversion. So he famously said, in Surprised by Joy, looking back at his intellectual life and imaginative life in the 20s, such then was the state of my imaginative life. Over against it stood the life of my intellect. The two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. I mean, he's put his finger on something. It's not just himself. He's put his finger right on the horrible split, the kind of epistemological apartheid we've all been subjected to, that there's so-called objective facts out there which are completely value-free, and the universe is just stuff, just an agglomeration of stuff to do things with. And insofar as there's any beauty or music or love or yearning or value, that's all just subjective. It's just in here. It's not as real. as the concatenation of atoms outside. That's a split you can argue went back to Descartes, that Descartes split between res extensa, stuff out there, and res cogitans, stuff in here. And we're all still, our great-great-great-great-grandparents, ate sour grapes, and our teeth are still set on edge by that split in ways of knowing. Lewis is just a very finely articulated example of it there. He had to struggle to get out of that. Now, we might look back on that and say, well, he was writing that in Surprised by Joy, another book of the 50s. What evidence do we have about what it was really like for him at the time? Well, luckily, we do have evidence. We have this extraordinary poem, which in Walter Hooper's collected poems of 1964 was titled Reason. Lewis never published it in his own lifetime. Hooper doesn't date it. And I couldn't believe, after I'd read it at depth several times, that it could possibly have been called Reason, that Lewis would never have given it that title, because it's about a balance and tension between reason and imagination. And to title it Reason would be to upset precisely the poise of the dilemma that the poem is about. I thought if he'd give it a title at all, it would have been Who, because it asked the question, who will reconcile? Luckily, before his death, I had a chance to talk to Walter Hooper about it. And I said, look, was that Lewis's title? And he said, no, it was just on a piece of paper. It had no title at all. But I gave it the title Reason because reason comes in the first line. And I thought it was more about reason than not. But so I said, oh, what a relief, because I don't think it's just about reason at all. So we know this was written sometime before his conversion. The content of the poem makes that clear. I thought it might have been written about, say, 28 or 29, but actually Alistair McGrath thinks this might have been written as early as 25 or 26, in which case he was living for about 5 years with the question posed by this poem. And it's a question that I think many people are still having to live with, and it's interesting to see how Lewis put it, and how he answered it, or how God answered it for him in the end. And it takes you a little bit further in his development of the word imagination. You say, looking back, he says, nearly all I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all, I believed to be real. I thought grim and meaningless. So he's got that standard imaginary versus real, which is what would have been the split if I'd said imagination and bodies. Yeah, he thinks that they're different. He's not yet, according to this backward look from Surprised by Joy, ready to think of the imagination as a truth-bearing faculty. This poem takes us inside that, but it actually suggests that he is beginning to be ready to see a balance and poise, even though for the moment it feels like an opposition between reason and imagination. Let's look at that poem. And it's an extraordinary poem. I mean, the extended metaphor is to think of ourselves, each person, as like the ancient city of Athens, with on the one hand, the Acropolis, the Parthenon, the perfectly beautiful geometry and exact mathematics of that aspect of Greek culture. But as you know, I mean, there's a great book by Kito called The Greeks and the Irrational, and there are the Eleusinian mysteries, and there's all the kind of, the sort of other aspects of Greek religion and faith. And he uses that as an analogy or a model for what it's like to be a person. And let's just hear the poem and we'll see what he does with it. So it's a fantastic poem. So, set on the soul's Acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light. And he who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white. So clear is reason. But how dark, imagining. Warm, dark, obscure and infinite, daughter of night, dark is her brow. The beauty of her eyes with sleep is loaded, and her pains are long, and her delight. Tempt not Athene. Wound not in her fertile pains Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. Oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make in me a concord of the depth and height, who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight, then could I truly say and not deceive, then wholly say that I believe. I mean, it really is an astonishing poem. I mean, there's a huge amount to say about it, and I'm already running out of time. But I suppose the first thing one ought to remark on, in terms of, we've rightly had some rebuke today to the sort of caricature Hollywood version of Lewis as this kind of crusty old Don in the tweed jacket. I mean, he did wear tweed jackets, of course, but, this crusty old Don who's all repressed and, can only get on with men, and, there's a little sort of boys' club of the Inklings, and it takes the feisty American woman to open him up and get him in touch with his, emotions. And it's all complete specious nonsense. But if you wanted evidence of it, here's Bachelor Lewis in this male-dominated Oxford, trying to talk about his inner life and figuring or bodying forth the two elemental powers of the soul in reason and imagination, figuring them both as goddesses, as Athene, the goddess of wisdom on the one hand, and Demeter, a goddess of fertility on the other. And saying, how do I mean, if I could sum up what Lewis is saying in this poem in contemporary language, what Lewis is saying is, my problem is I can't get my inner goddesses together, which is not what you expect from the crusty old male, male, pale and stale, as we heard earlier on. I can't get my inner goddesses together. He's really serious about it. These are living powers in the soul. And the great cry is, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? By this time, he's already intuited that reason and imagination have a kind of parity. They're both goddesses. On the one hand, tempt not Athene. That is to say, if you see logically that something is the case and you know something to be true, don't, for convenience or as a sop to your longings or as a piece of propaganda for someone else, don't say that they're not true. Don't call truth untruth. If you know that 2 and 2 is 4, let it be 4, even if it be far more convenient for you if it were 5. He who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white. He was partly holding off from Christianity because he wanted to be true. And if Christianity is not the case, even if he longed for it to be the case, he would be sinning against Athene. But of course, he's coming to realize more and more that Athene is actually on the side of Christianity, because the Logos is the divine reason and has put the divine reason in us. But having said tempt not Athene, he has now admitted that Demeter, the imagination, is not just about the imaginary, but is about the whole way we understand the world. So wound not in her fertile pains, Demeter. Fertile pains is just incredibly powerful language, because of course he's therefore thinking about labor pains, the actual pains of fertility and giving birth, and he's seeing that as part of something that every creative person and writer goes through, as well as every mother. But also he's using the word pains in the sense of taking pains over a piece of work, really working on it to see it's right. The proper long labor, in the other sense of the word labor, of literary birthing. So, wound not in her fertile pains, Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. He's beginning to get a sense that these are two complementary ways of knowing, and yet they, in his culture, in modernity, they've been utterly opposed. But he recognizes their ways of knowing. And it's interesting, he assigns different senses to them. He assigns sight to reason, seeing a thing clearly. And he assigns touch to imagination, this exploring touch. It's wonderful. But he needs to know that if anything is going to be the case, and clearly what's in question here is Christianity, is whether he's going to believe Christianity or not. If he is to believe Christianity, then it has to satisfy both reason and imagination. And you kind of want to come up to him. I understand they have pantomime on this stage. There's a point at which you want to say to Jack here, he's behind you, Jack. He's asking this big question, who could possibly reconcile in me, both maid and mother? Who make a concord of the depth and height? And he's almost echoing the language of that great blessing that Paul gives in Ephesians to the new believers at Ephesus, that ye being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend, that key word out of the Shakespeare, with all the saints, what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God. The very frame of the question is beginning to gesture towards Christ. So, for that matter, is he saying, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? Well, hasn't he yet guessed that there's only one faith in which somebody is both a maid and a mother, through whom the divine imagination, as he's later to call him, is bodied forth and given a local habitation and a name? Now, I'm sure many of you, all Lewis scholars and fans, will know what followed, how he had that famous walk, round Addison's Walk, with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, and in which they talked about myth, and he was talking about his delight in all these stories of dying and rising gods and Balder the Beautiful. And then the subject turns to Christianity, and Lewis is resisting both Tolkien and Dyson, a Catholic and an Anglo-Catholic, walking along with him. And he says, I don't see what difference the life and death of somebody, in mere factual history, back there would make to me. Well done, Jesus, bully for him. Why should this episode, if it happened in history 2,000 years ago, even if there was a resurrection, what difference does that make to me? It's just another item in the catalogue of things that have happened. And Tolkien says, Jack, I don't believe you're saying this. You've just been talking about how immensely moved you are by the mythic resonance of a death and resurrection God. And he says, yeah, but that's myth. That's beautiful to move my imagination, And this is fact. And then Lewis says, can't you see that myth has been made fact here? Can't you see that all the great stories that have ever moved your imagination have now been bodied forth into this thing, which is absolutely properly accessible to your reason and part of history? Crucified under Pontius Pilate, and when Quirinius was governor of Syria. It's in the realm of history. And yet the events have mythical resonance and never lose their mythical resonance. And you can almost feel the two hemispheres of Lewis's mind that had been so divided coming together in the course of that walk. And what they come together around is the figure of Christ. And you get that later in his essays like The Poison of Subjectivism or the essay, Myth Made History. Somehow, the answer to that question he'd written in a poem, possibly years before, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make a concord of the depth and height? Who, we might say, connect heaven and earth and heaven, and body them forth, and give to them a local habitation and a name? And the answer to that question was absolutely Christ. And I think all of Lewis's writing after that event is drawing from that beautiful fusion, the kind of energy released in the fusion at last of reason and imagination, a way of finding them to work together rather than pull against one another. And when we had the great celebration in 2013, the 50 years after Lewis's death, and he was finally honoured in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, there were two lectures, and I was giving one, and Alistair McGrath was giving the other. And I was supposed to be talking about Lewis and the imagination and the apologetics, if you like, the imaginative appeal, imaginative apologetics account that was there in Lewis's fiction, in the Narnia books and in the Space Trilogy. And Alistair McGrath was supposed to be talking about Lewis's appeal to reason, the rational arguments, the trilemma and all that sort of thing in Mere Christianity and the Problem of Pain and so on, and miracles. And we both immediately came up with a difficulty. We ended up phoning each other about it. I realized that some of the best rational arguments for believing in Christianity are embedded deep in the Narnia stories, like the whole business in The Silver Chair, where he basically rewrites Plato's myth of the cave, and the question about what's real and what isn't, and whether the round lamp is only there because there's no sun, but the sun is a projection of the round lamp, or Aslan is a projection of the cat or not. There's that. So he's appealing to reason. Meantime, Alistair McGrath was realizing that every time Lewis had a really strong rational argument to say that at least you weren't you weren't tempting Athena, you weren't going against the truth. There was a rational case to be made for Christianity. Lewis almost always bodied it forth with a brilliantly imaginative illustration. And so we ended up saying to each other, we can't divide this. These two things are mutually enfolded. And in fact, their mutual enfoldment was itself expressed very pithily in a single sentence by Lewis in the weirdly named essay, Blue Spells and Flalanspheres. There's a whole story behind the strangeness of that name. But there he says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. The two things are mutually enfolded. But I have to say that I think once he was converted to its reliability as a mode of knowing truth, that it would begin to report the same as intellectual sight, although not, of course, in the same language. Lewis moved more and more deeply into the imaginative. But it was the imaginative, we're going to have to miss out lots of things, but I'll end it. It was the imaginative, not in only the imaginary, made up, disembodied, but the imaginative understood as that which is always seeking body, form, and a local habitation and a name. And if you think of the great images of goodness, which is so hard to write about. Philip Larkin was once asked why he always write depressing poems. And he said, well, happiness writes white, meaning it's like you're writing with a white pen on white paper. There are no contrasts. It's very difficult to describe, what the hymn calls solid joys and lasting treasure. Lewis does it abundantly again and again. He does it, not only in the golden goodness of Aslan, but the kind of lovely domesticity of the Beaver's house in Beaver's Dam, or, again in the community of St. Anne's on the hill in the Space Trilogy. He's very good at that. And it's always particular. It's always embodied, because he'd learnt what he says finally in such extraordinary and beautiful summary sentence in Reflections on the Psalms, for poetry too is a little incarnation, giving body to what had been before invisible and inaudible. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Malcolm, I wonder whether I might just ask a quick question. In terms of, Peter Kraft once said, with respect to C.S.Lewis as a literary writer, that it hasn't yet been fully appreciated or understood to what extent the accomplishment of translating Christ, as it were, into the figure of Aslan truly is. I wonder, in terms of embodiment and incarnation of a concept, of more than a concept, of logos, how do you think Lewis did in the figure of Aslan?
Well, that's a great question. And I think the first thing is to think about the way round he did it. I talked about that glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. He was, I think, emphatically not writing a frigid allegory. He claimed, I think rather in the teeth of the evidence, that he was ever being allegorical. I think there are, and Tolkien thought it was being too allegorical. But when Lewis is writing critically against allegory, he says, the problem with allegory is that it's just a kind of trick of the irony that, the person has proposition A, they translate it into allegory B, and then you can translate it back into proposition A, and proposition A is absolutely unaltered by its brief transit through the bodying forth of the allegorical story. That is, he emphatically thought, was a terrible way of writing, and he gives some examples in his scholarly book, The Allegory of Love, on how badly that could be done. However, what he contrasted with allegory in that sense, the task of, how can I take the following 5, dogmatic propositions about Christ and translate them into something golden and furry, but it'll make no difference, you'll be back where you started, when you've got the code. He was emphatically not doing that, and the books would have been appalling if he had done that. He was trying to write in what he called a mytho-poetic way. And what he praised in Tolkien, I think he also wanted to try and achieve himself, where you write a story which is so open to symbolism that it's full of incipient allegories. But some of those are ones, and this is the test, that the author themselves learns from the act of writing. Now, Lewis says he'd started with the picture. The first thing that he had since he was a 16-year-old, he had a picture of a faun walking through a snowy wood towards a lamppost. It was just like what do I do with that? So in a sense, he was just trying to make sense of this pictorial image he'd been carrying since he was a teenager. But as he says in one of his letters, Aslan came bounding in and pulled the whole story together. So the arrival of Aslan was as much a surprise to Lewis, who'd already begun a Narnia story without him, as was the arrival of Strider in the Inn of the Prancing Pony. Tolkien said to the Inklings when he was reading that when Strider first appears, Tolkien said, I had no more idea who he was than Frodo did. He discovers, then the whole backstory of Strider pulls the whole story together. In both cases, they are a hidden king, both Aslan and in both cases, they're in some sense a Christ figure who appears without disclosing that that's who they are and demands their attention. So he refused to call it an allegory. What he said, he called The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe a supposal. Now, the supposal was, suppose there were another world quite different from ours, operating under different rules, in this case, a kingdom of animals. Suppose the incarnation and the salvation, and specifically the crucifixion and resurrection, suppose they were to happen there, in that world, under that world's laws, in its own, what might that be like? Just as he makes a supposal in the planetary trilogy, supposing they know of the word of the Malildale, the great angel, supposing they don't know about the incarnation that happened on the silent planet, they don't even know what. They know that God is going to do something with the silent planet, but they don't know what it is. And Ransom has the astonishing and humbling task of revealing that. It's a supposal. So I think Lewis almost certainly learned from his imaginative forming of Aslan a little bit more about Christ himself. The point he says, where he almost breaks the spell of the story, which I've given you as one of my passages, where he says, you are two old children, you must begin to come close to your own world now. It isn't Narnia, sobbed Lucy, it's you. We shan't meet you there, how can we ever meet you? But you shall meet me there, dear one. The very reason why you were brought to Narnia was that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there. Now, knowing me here is the important thing. The knowing him in his Narnian terms will teach you better things you might not have known had you only come to him in the other level. You see the difference? It's not packing something pre-digested into a cipher. It's learning from the storytelling itself a little more about the mystery that you began with.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Could you maybe say something about Lewis's use of the term baptized imagination?
Yes, sorry. It's there's lots to say about that. So just to give everybody context, the place in which Lewis uses the term baptized imagination is in the passage in Surprised by Joy, where he's talking about his first reading of George MacDonald and how little he knew what was waiting for him when he picks up the dusty second-hand copy of Fantastes from the railway bookstore and starts to read it on the train. And a lot of people gloss that word baptized as simply meaning given a quick Christian seal of approval, a kind of, imprimatur. I don't think he means it. When he says baptized, he means death and resurrection. Baptism, you're baptized into the death of Christ, and then you rise up out of the waters into his risen life. Something has to die as well as rise in baptism. So he thinks that he says he crossed a border, something that could have been entirely self-serving and corrosive in everybody's capacity for fantasy and imagination, was challenged and died a little death by the holiness of MacDonald's imagination. He was opened up to the possibility of a redeemed imagination. It's not that he never then had the imagination of the old Adam, but he was shown what the imagination of the new Adam might be. So I think when you say baptized imagination, it's not just baptizing the imagination in some broad generic way, like saying, if you imagined it, it must be good. That's not the case. But saying that the imagination, like every other faculty in us, must on the one hand die to self and on the other hand live to Christ. And that happens in some deep way before he knows its meaning. I think he also uses the word baptism because he's in a culture in which children are baptized or christened. And if you like, learn much later the meaning of the rite. But it's still an efficacious rite. I think Lewis believed that. So there's a sense in which, as a sheer mercy, something is given to him, some cleansing, some renewal, some repurposing of imagination is given in advance by the encounter with George MacDonald. And that shields him in some way from the worst of his Wagnerian excesses later on. Does it make sense?
Thanks for your talk. Just about the link between reason and imagination, you've quoted Narnia and other such examples. How would you place the Pilgrim's Regress in your remarks about allegory and reason and so forth?
Well, of course, Pilgrim's Regress was his first effort writing after his conversion. And it's strongly influenced by the fact that he was working on the allegory of love. And obviously, Pilgrim's Regress is itself riffing on the title Pilgrim's Progress, and therefore he's looking to Bunyan. And it's a much more explicitly allegorical book than anything else he wrote. And in fact, he thought the allegory was a bit too obvious. But then his publishers said, people don't get this at all. And he had to write all those little explanations and running chapters at the beginning of it to explain that, Mr. Neo-Angular is really, high Anglicans like T.S. Eliot or whatever, So I think most scholars would agree that it's probably, at an imaginative level, his least successful book. But least successful for Lewis is still way better than a lot of other books. And I think there's a huge amount to learn from it, both about Lewis's own progress and about our own journeys. I think his learning from the figure of history in that, his way of understanding medieval Christianity in the image of the lady, his rereading of the whole chivalric cult and culture is really good. When the book, probably the most powerful bit of the book is the securite produce bit, where he realizes in the end he's got to risk everything and he has to dive. That's the baptism in that book. He has to dive right down and then swim under and come up on another side. And that involves complete letting go of all security. That realization that he could be intellectually posturing about the possible resonant coherence of Christianity to the end of his days and never be a Christian. If he didn't finally, utterly let himself go into God with no promises of it working, just do it. It's an interesting biographical fact that in the summer that he was writing that book, he was learning to dive from, of all people, Owen Barfield, who was the very one who taught him to trust the imagination. And I think that's a bit where the allegory works incredibly well. But I think some of the other allegorical figures in that are too close to actually rather bitter Oxford satire than generous imaginative work. So that's the way I would be my take on that book.
It's a pity it's not more read.
Yeah, it's got a lot to teach. I would still commend it to anyone. And if you want a good, memorable allegorical account of intellectual history since the Middle Ages as it applies to Christianity, that's your book. And it does that incredibly well.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Guite. Insofar as the scriptures tell us to love the Lord your God with all your mind, would you say that that's an invitation to an intellectual comprehension of
I think it's both. When it says love the Lord with all your God and all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, that's clearly intended to be comprehensive. It's an instancing of some of the elements of the whole of you. But it says love the God with the whole of you. And I think probably all your mind means with your reason, and all your heart and all your soul is probably more correspondent to what we're talking about with with all your imagination, but you give the whole thing to God. And therefore, every part of you, both your reason and your imagination, are capable of loving God. And I think in this case, capable of apprehending and comprehending God. And the purpose of the imagination, the poetic imagination, as your mind works on it in the act of loving God, is to woo apprehension into comprehension. And also to take the things you think you understand and comprehend and open them up to new apprehensions. And that's the work of a lifetime, and it's certainly the work of love. I think what's interesting about Jesus' quotation of that Old Testament commandment is that we rightly apply it to the use of our minds in knowing things, but only rightly because knowledge is or should be an aspect of love. The commandment is not to know, but to love. But what I think we've discovered is that there are certain things you can't know without loving first. You can't wait for you have to love first in order to know. Anybody, who's been in a loving relationship, anybody who's in a marriage knows that the love comes first and the knowledge unfolds within the love. And it wouldn't be the same knowledge if the love wasn't there. I think one of the problems with academic and abstract theology is it tries to do things with the mind outside of love. And that's where it goes wrong.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question.
Yeah.
Is
and I might round it up with a poem just for the fun of it. Right, go on.
Could you switch hats for a second to your poet hat?
Yeah.
And talk about how you, as a poet, seek to give local habitation to airy nothings in view of all the things that you've been talking about.
Wow, right. Well, I think one of the, in the course of writing a poem, obviously you write a lot of things which you hoped would be poems, but turn out not to be poems. They're sort of stillborn, or they, but one of the things that makes you know that what you're working on is possibly a poem is the sense when it quickens and kicks and pushes back against what you thought you were going to write. That the poem knows what its body should be. It knows more about its name than you do, and it starts telling you how to write it. And it may not have been your original plan A. And, I can remember when I wrote the poem at the beginning of my sequence on the sayings of Jesus, which was the he who has ears to hear, let him hear. But I was trying to talk about the idea of opening up the scriptures. And at the beginning of the poem, it was all about how do I remove the film of familiarity from these sayings of Jesus? How do I unwrap them? How do I kind of take them out of the sort of the cerements of familiarity and let them be fresh? That was the poem I thought I was going to write. And that's the poem I started writing. And then in the middle of the poem, it turned around and said, no. And it produced, unbidden, the image of Jesus saying to Lazarus, come forth, and then saying, unbind him. And by the end of the poem, I realized what hollow arrogance it was to have thought that I was going to unwrap Scripture. It's Scripture that, so in the end of it, I'm saying to Jesus, unloose me, untie me, take all these bandages and wrappings off me, and let me be exposed. And Scripture becomes the two-edged sword that it was meant to be. So the poem knew more than I did about what it needed to be. And that's, I think, where the language of bodying forth is really important, because a body, in this case, is a living thing. It's not a corpse, it's a living, moving, growing body that pushes and wants to grow into its own shape. And that's very exciting when you're writing, when the poem quickens as you're writing it. And then you have to start listening to the poem as well as to what you thought the poem was going to be. And that way you learn from it. That way you write a poem which knows more than you do. And that's the real joy of writing. And that's why, to go back to the question, I think the Narnia stories knew more about Jesus than Lewis himself knew at the time of his writing. And he was learning from them too as he was writing them. Maybe, since you've asked me to write in poet mode, I could just close with the poem I meant to end with, but I ran out of time. Which is just called C.S.Lewis. The only thing you need to know really about this poem is that when Lewis you had to teach at Oxford as a tutor all the subjects within language and literature. People went to the specialist lectures, but your director of studies was supposed to give you everything. So Lewis, although Tolkien was the great Anglo-Saxon specialist, Lewis nevertheless taught Anglo-Saxon. But he didn't call it Anglo-Saxon 101, the vowel shift. He called it Beer and Beowulf. And he had a jug of beer there and he gave his tutees, to drink, and then they read Beowulf together. So that, I allude to that at the beginning of this. So C.S. Lewis. From beer and Beowulf to the seven heavens, whose music you conduct from sphere to sphere. You are our portal to those hidden havens whence we return to bless our being here. Scribe of the kingdom, keeper of the door which opens onto all we might have lost, ward of a word hoard in the deep heart's core, telling the tale of love from first to last, generous, capacious, open, free. Your wardrobe mind has furnished us with worlds through which to travel, whence we learn to see along the beam and hear at last the heralds sounding their summons through the stars that sing, whose call at sunrise brings us to our King. Thank you.